Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second of IGP's Soundbites for the spring term. My name is Dr. Saffron Woodcraft. I'm Principal Research Fellow at the Institute for Global Prosperity and chairing this session on behalf of Professor Henrietta Moore, who can't join us because she's at a conference today. I'm really delighted to welcome today's speaker, Mike Hawking. Mike is Head of Policy and Partnerships at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Joseph Rowntree Foundation was established over a century ago, 1904, and has been working to tackle poverty in the UK. The foundation's vision is for a prosperous UK without poverty, and the foundation works in a number of ways, using research and policy reform, campaigning and practical action to understand and tackle the root causes of poverty. Mike leads Joseph Rowntree Foundation's work looking at how local economies and local labour markets can lift more people out of poverty. His areas of expertise include work on the living wage, labour markets, education and skills policies, and thinking about neighbourhood connectivity. Mike's work has a particular focus on the role of cities and city regions in creating jobs and improving the quality of work. And before joining the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, Mike was an advisor to the directly elected mayor of Lewisham and has worked on housing and social security policy for a number of years in charities and housing associations in London and in Leeds. So we're delighted to have Mike with us today to talk about industrial strategy and local actions to deliver more inclusive growth. Thank you, Mike. I'll open the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Saffron. I'm just now going to share my screen, hopefully, and you should each be able to see it. So thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here today. I think I was going to touch on a little bit about background to JRF, but I think Saffron's given a really great introduction to what we're doing. I think that the key thing to highlight is that although we've been at this for more than a century, there's still a long way to go in terms of our understanding of the causes and solutions to poverty in the UK. What I'm going to touch on today is focused on local action to deliver inclusive growth. So I'm going to touch on a little bit about some of the definitions around inclusive growth and some of the things that we at JRF have been recommending to local places and what they can really focus on. It's very much from a UK context, and a lot of the things that we're recommending and suggesting are to do with practical application that can be adopted now, and that I'll touch on why that's quite crucial shortly. So first of all, a bit of background. Why are we interested in this? Well, the latest evidence from before the coronavirus shows that an unacceptable 14.5 million people in the UK were caught up in poverty, and that equates to about 22 in every 100 people. And I think one of the things that we need to reflect on is that over the last 15 years, there hasn't been very much change in this headline figure. So although progress has been made around pensioner poverty and child poverty in the past, in terms of that headline figure, very little. It's been quite stable over the last 15 years or so. I think more worryingly, actually, average incomes in 2018-19 were actually lower than in 2016-17 once they're adjusted for inflation. And there was a really big fall for the poorest fifth of individuals whose incomes were actually below the levels of 2010 and 2011. At JRF, we've actually begun to call this a decade of deprivation because of that fall in incomes for the lowest people in our society. But once you actually unpick the headline figure a bit, there's a bit more fluctuation about what's going on. And one of the big changes in poverty in the UK over the last 20 years or so is that it's gone from being a problem of people out of work to a problem predominantly by people in work. There are now more people living in households where someone is in work and in poverty than there are living in households where there is workless households and poverty. This chart is basically trying to show a little bit about what's happened to in-work poverty, which we define as the proportion of workers who are in poverty over recent years. and it stood at almost 13% of all workers in 2018-19. You can see it's actually been rising quite steadily over time, and since sort of the since around about 2000, it's gone up from just over 2 million to now peaking at about 4 million. A lot of this is related to increases in employment. So the employment rate has been increasing over that period of time, but it isn't right that some of the jobs that are being created just aren't good enough to get people out of poverty. And I think we know a lot about the groups of people who are particularly impacted by this, whether because of the hours or hourly pay that they've got available to them, their location, someone's gender, their ethnicity or their age, or other barriers such as childcare or transport. And what we actually think this means is that the economy just isn't working sufficiently well for people in poverty, and they're not getting or not able to get the jobs that are really going to help them escape poverty, lift them out of poverty. And that's why we think there needs to be a more inclusive approach which produces better job opportunities for all of us. Now, just quickly, I can't really present anything in the current state without touching on COVID, because clearly those statistics were based on before the pandemic hit us. And I think we all know there's a lot of information, a lot of analysis being driven around the health inequalities and the health effects of the pandemic. I'm not going to touch on those now, but actually the economic impacts of the pandemic and the consequences of the lockdowns and various different public health interventions that we've had to make are having serious consequences on the economy. I think one of the things to highlight is that actually, although government interventions to protect jobs have generally been pretty successful, there is still quite a big unemployment risk, and the charts that are on your screen at the moment are from this week's ONS stats on the labour market, which shows employment rates falling, unemployment rising, and economic activity rising. I mean, there is some caution about the levels that we're looking at here because of the amount of economic support that's still in the economy at the moment. And we really are still expecting an increase in unemployment over the coming months, which is likely to hit those already struggling to stay afloat, and risk many more people being swept into poverty. We know that many of the sectors hit hardest, retail, hospitality, travel and leisure, for example, are those that employ many people in low-paid work, and I think that's something that's really concerning to us. It's likely that existing labour market inequalities that we'd seen before the pandemic struck will be exacerbated, but it's also likely that new ones will be appearing as well. I think this makes the case for a more inclusive economy or more inclusive growth greater, but it might also make the solutions to creating a more inclusive economy a little bit harder as well. So I now want to move on to a little bit about trying to understand what we mean by inclusive growth, or what we mean by trying to deliver an inclusive economy. And it is a contested term, and there are lots of competing definitions out there. The two on your screen is one from the OECD and one from the RSA and their Inclusive Growth Commission from three or 4 years ago now. And I think it's really quite interesting how different terms are being used: inclusive growth, inclusive economies. They're obviously very different potential understandings of those terms, but I think it's helpful to think about where these terms have come from, why they're appropriate, and what we should be aiming for. Inclusive growth as a concept, I think the term is something that essentially began to be used in development economics, but in the early 2000s. It replaced an earlier term as pro-poor growth, essentially. And this chart is taken from a really great paper from Neil Lee at the LSE, showing Google searches for those two terms. And you can see that pro-poor growth in the early 2000s was much more predominant in terms of Google searches versus inclusive growth. And then when it came to sort of around about the time of the Great Recession, of the economic crisis of 2008-2009, inclusive growth began to be taken over as the predominant Googled term. And I think what lies at the heart of both terms and a lot of the thinking around inclusive economies is that there was a recognition that despite rapidly growing economies, and if you think about in development economics, we're thinking about BRIC nations in particular, people in poverty weren't always benefiting from the opportunities that were being created through rapidly growing economies. I think the Great Recession prompted some of those discussions in wealthier nations as well, as they began to recover from it, asking about whether or not people in poverty and those on the lowest incomes were really benefiting from the opportunities from the recovery that was being created. And I think thinking about the outcomes and thinking about who is benefiting became much more conscious in people's minds, in decision makers' minds. And that's where the leap came from inclusive growth being something that was just concerned about within development economics versus something that was more used in OECD nations and the UK and others. So in terms of how we at JF define it, we actually think inclusive growth is about enabling more people and places to contribute and benefit from success, and try to be more specific and actually say that we think it should be about reducing poverty through the creation of better jobs and better quality of jobs. And for us, it's actually about trying to deliver an economy which has different outcomes for a particular group of people, for the lowest paid in our economy. There are, of course, critiques of this, and there are several, and I won't touch on them all here, and we'll be getting into some of them in the question and answer. Not least that the term inclusive growth or inclusive economies don't explicitly embed environmental goals, and actually some experts would even say that growth as a term is problematic in this context. And I think that's fair criticism. I think that environmental objectives and environmental goals can be fully embedded in these sorts of things and these sorts of concepts and ideas. But I think our concern is about the inclusion of people, and particularly those who are in poverty or at risk of being in poverty. One of the reasons why we at JF have found this terminology really useful is that it allows us to get into discussions about the economy and us as an anti-poverty organisation that we sometimes struggle to get into. Growth strategies and plans still dominate economic development thinking, whether that be locally in the UK or within different nations. Actually, the concept of inclusive growth means that you start to get those policymakers thinking much more clearly about who is benefiting and what are the outcomes that you're actually achieving through the initiatives you're creating. But the challenge, the big challenge, is obviously getting on and delivering it and trying to take action and implement policies and ideas that are actually going to deliver more inclusive growth. And in the UK, the term has been more readily adopted by devolved governments, so in Scotland in particular, and cities and city regions than it has the sort of UK government. And I think what's not surprising is that with one of the most centralised government systems in the world, it actually makes it extra tough for committed policymakers to really take action that's going to deliver a more inclusive economy, because many of the policy levers, many of the decisions that you would want to take, you're not in control of, and they rest with the UK central government, and that means that you've got to, when we've been thinking about this hard, we've been trying to think about where can we influence and where can we help to shape ideas and shape thinking. And I think when the Theresa May government announced its industrial strategy and published its industrial strategy, which focused on boosting the economy and addressing the UK's productivity issues in particular, and trying to pull up the UK's lagging places, that was an area that we really wanted to focus on. The strategy, as published then back in sort of 2018, focused on had quite a big place element to it. So it recommended that, or it required mayoral combined authorities and LEPs in England, the local enterprise partnerships in England, to create local industrial strategies which fitted in to the broader national strategy. And we really tried to focus in on how we can help local policymakers who are devising and writing those local industrial strategies to make a difference and try and embed inclusive growth principles and aims in there. Our starting point was actually was pulling out the aims of the industrial strategy, which are on the screen. And I think even though a lot of the discussion around the UK's industrial strategy at this moment in time was around productivity and raising the UK's productivity and trying to tackle that problem, it did acknowledge that actually productivity is not an end of itself. The actual strategy had twin aims, around the second being to improve earning power and touched on raising living standards. And the case we made with policymakers was that it was living standards that industrial strategies and local and central governments that are developing them that will be judged on by citizens, not on whether productivity is improved, because that's the thing that people notice in their pockets. It's the increases in pay, it's the standard of living, not whether their workplace is more productive. Now, a lot has changed since the industrial strategy was published. So I'm not going to touch on in too much of the detail in terms of how we're structured, because a lot of the things that we try to influence were in terms of local decision making was around the structure of this particular strategy. So instead, I'll take you through some of the sorts of things that we're recommending in a hopefully slightly simpler way to explore what we're trying to set out. Again, the thing that I'd really like to highlight is that these were very much focused, that our recommendations and our thinking were very much focused on practical actions that local leaders, local decision makers could take in the UK context. So some of the things that I'm about to present, they're by no means exhaustive. They're by no means by no means do we think they are the limits of what an industrial strategy can do. I don't, for example, touch on R&D investment, innovation, technology here, but those are things definitely that an inclusive, growth-focused industrial strategy could be doing. What I've done here is thinking about some of the practical activities that local decision makers have powers over or can influence to do. So the first is about simply creating more good jobs, and that sounds really incredibly simple, doesn't it? If only we could create more good jobs, that would be the route out, the route out of this challenge. And we try to look and understand about how different places, different parts of the world, different cities, different regions have actually tried to do this, and some practical examples of where it's done this well. One of the places we looked at was San Antonio, which was a fast-growing city in the US. And I think the big learning here was that their city leadership at the time of developing their economic policies recognised that a low-wage economic strategy, which is just focused on attracting inward investors into the city, wasn't sustainable. And they had a focus not just on growing the economy, but focused on actually growing the number of good jobs in the economy. And that meant both by attracting inward investment and but also actually trying to grow the existing business base, support them to grow and support them to develop good quality jobs. Part of their strategy was actually understanding where their strengths lie, what they were good at. And actually what their populations were good at as well, so where the skills existed, and invested heavily in the local population to access jobs that were being created through education skills at all levels, with a particular focus on sector-led training. And there's a really, really important thing here about the task force that they created, which was focused on middle skill strategy, and it targeted job creation and targeted jobs that required more than a high school diploma in the US, but less than a bachelor's degree as the core focus of its work. So it tried to focus on that sort of higher technical skills and helping people on low incomes with fewer formal qualifications to build up those skills to access the higher technical qualifications, which would then help them access to a sort of middle tier of job, not just access entry-level jobs. That it wasn't just about pushing people into any job, but actually focused on how can we get people into good quality employment. In the UK, there's other examples. There are definitely other examples that can be done using existing levers. So through the business grant program that many LEPs and many local areas control, there's some really great examples of how conditions or requirements have been attached to say that we expect a certain level of job quality or a certain level of number of apprenticeships to be created as a result of this investment in your business. So the Leeds City region has done some work on that. Liverpool City region have done some work on it too, and there are some other city regions looking at it in the same way. Again, the key is that there were some conditions attached to business grants, but the conditions were always related to the actual grant that was being provided. So, for example, if the grant was being provided to buy a new piece of equipment to make the business more productive, the ask wasn't about making sure that the job quality that was coming through directly from that grant were going to be the highest form, because actually an investment in technology might not necessarily produce more good jobs. So it's about what else could the business do to support more inclusive economy. And finally, the other thing that around creating more good jobs was focusing on social value from infrastructure investments. At the time that the industrial strategy was written, and as is happening now with the government's levelling up agenda, there's a lot of cash being put into infrastructure. But what we're really trying to push local decision makers to do is to think about, well, what are the outputs of that infrastructure going to be? What are the jobs that are going to be produced, and how can you ensure that the jobs that are coming as a result of infrastructure investment going to be good quality? Using the Social Value Act to help guide and direct investments to make sure that jobs that are being created are going to be of good quality and are actually also going to be accessible to people. So we know, for example, there are really good examples of new train lines and how Crossrail and other schemes have been developed that, as well as new investments that are going in, there is a side-by-side employment and skills strategy which helps people in the local community access jobs on that infrastructure scheme, and helps to upskill them, helps to train them, and make sure that they can access the jobs that are available. As I sort of mentioned, improving existing jobs is also a key to it. So actually trying to boost jobs that exist, the jobs that currently exist in the economy, and make sure that they become of good quality. And in the UK, there's many examples of how city regions, local areas are trying to use good work charters to set the standard, try and set standards to that. And that's the case of city leaders in places like London and Greater Manchester, north of Tyne, looking at this, Liverpool too, and there's some good work in Scotland happening as well, which is essentially working with businesses, working with communities to define what good work should look like, and trying to encourage employers to sign up to that. The big challenge is how do you actually get low-paid sectors to sign up to those charters. But the principle is trying to use influence and soft power of local institutions to try and encourage and improve job quality in the community. I think a part of that is the role of anchor institutions, and by that we mean big, large-scale employers that are based or headquartered in a place, and most often it's the public sector institutions, the universities, the local authorities, the hospitals that can provide this focus. And many places are again looking at this. There's some great examples of Cleveland in the US that have done this. There's also some interesting examples. The Preston model in the UK have driven that, but also places like Leeds and several other local areas are trying to look at how you can use the collective power of anchor institutions, who often employ large numbers of people within a particular place, to improve job quality, improve pay. So, for example, paying the living wage is one way of doing it, but also using their procurement powers to try and ensure that jobs in the supply chain are of good quality as well. Again, might be insisting on paying the living wage in supply chains, or it might even be breaking up larger procurement contracts to try and encourage SMEs and local SMEs to bid for pots of to bid for contracts such as cleaning or other sort of local service type delivery programs. There's also opportunities to support better jobs in low-paying sectors. And there was a really interesting work done by the Chartered Institute for Professional Development, which has established some pilot programs across in different parts of the country to work out how they can help provide small firms with HR support and advice in particular, and trying to think about particular targeting low-paying sectors. I think one of the really interesting things in this was actually about that many small businesses, small firms involved had people management needs that were much more basic than they expected. So I think that the CIPD team thought that they were going to go in and be talking to them about how they can bring in apprenticeships, how they can help support living wages, how they can do lots of other things. But actually what the support that many smaller businesses really needed was advice on employment contracts and legal compliance, and many just weren't ready to engage in that more transformational aspect on job quality. And I think that's something that's really key. And I think that applies to both low-paid sectors and SMEs and family-owned businesses as well, particularly when they're quite small. The family-owned business is a really interesting aspect to this, and I know several places in the UK have started to look at it in particular, because what can happen is that many people, some family-owned businesses which might start as like one or two family members operating a business, grows and starts to employ people, but often they don't actually have any experience about how to manage large numbers of people. They don't necessarily have any experience of how to employ people using proper contracts, using good people management skills, and trying to get into those sorts of businesses, try and provide that support can help to improve the quality of jobs that exist in the economy. And I think there's something important there about whether that's something that needs to be done through the state, or whether actually you can find peer-to-peer networks that might be able to try and provide some of that support, whether that's working through chambers of commerce or things like CIPD or other types of ways. But I think that's a really interesting area that many places have begun to explore a little bit. I've touched on this already, but there's something about improving people's skills, and that's really going to be hugely important to more inclusive economy. I think when you look at industrial strategies and many sort of ambitious growth plans or anything like that, often the focus is on higher level skills, very much focused on how you can ensure that there are more level 4 qualified people living in your area able to access jobs. We actually think that's a great ambition, but there does need to be a focus on improving basic skills as well, particularly for people living in poverty, given the numbers of people in poverty who have few formal qualifications, and that making sure that everyone has a baseline of skills is really important. And there's some really good examples of the citizens curriculum model, which promotes learning, which is locally led and involves learners in actually shaping its content. It has proved to be quite successful in supporting adult learners with fewer qualifications to really upskill and help to develop. I touched on the example with San Antonio there, but increasing the number of people with higher technical skills as well, particularly in the UK, is going to be crucial to more inclusive economies. We know about the divide between those people who go on to university and to higher education versus those people who do not. And I think there's a lot of work to be done to actually improve access to higher technical skills and the availability of that, and that does require coordination, working with colleges, working with providers to really try and get into that side of things. And then finally, supporting people to progress in work. So one of the reasons why in-work poverty has proved such a big challenge in the last 20 years or so is that people end up getting stuck in low-paid work, and there are very few opportunities to progress from a low-paid job into a higher-paid one. And we think that the places need to think more carefully about how they can offer people opportunities who are already in work to upskill and to progress and to develop. And there's some really good examples of work progression pilots, such as the Step Up programme in London, as well as some pilots in West Yorkshire and West of England, looking precisely at how you can help people on lower incomes progress into better paid jobs. Then in terms of local areas and local action, connecting people to opportunities is really key as well. So there's the skills is sort of one, that sort of human capital connection that people can make, but there's also these sort of physical connections too. So one of the, transport is obviously a big focus, and often industrial strategists think about how you ensure that high skilled people can travel from one city to another, or travel on a high speed rail route. And I think that you see the debate around HS2 in particular in the UK, but sometimes what's actually missed out is that local transport infrastructure, the importance of actually having high quality, reliable and affordable buses within a city, and how they can help connect people on low incomes to job opportunities is really crucial, and trying to ensure that those things are included in inclusive industrial strategies as well. Similarly, how a focus on good quality, low cost rented housing is going to be important. We know that in some places actually housing costs are one of the biggest drivers of poverty. And if you really want to try and create a more inclusive economy, then trying to help people reduce their housing costs by increasing the availability of low-cost rented housing is going to be really crucial. And then finally on this slide, that importance of high quality and affordable childcare, making sure that is supporting working parents, and really ensuring that the availability is there so that people can access work that's available, and can access that flexibly in as many ways as possible. I think during the pandemic, many of us are already experiencing the battle of balancing, of juggling childcare and working, and I think more investment in high quality affordable childcare is going to be key. Finally, the importance of places, and this is something that I tended to end on in this. This isn't a sort of local action around delivering more inclusive economies are going to look different in different places. They're going to have different priorities. The needs of different places are going to be quite different. So the priority in London versus the North East will look very different because their economies are very different. And we should accept and be willing to accept and be willing to support differences of approach across the country. And finally, just one thing to think about is that actually the role of places and the function of places within local labour markets is quite important to this. Sometimes I've often seen people talk about, well, if you analyse the productivity of different types of places or different locations in the UK, then that's a worry, without actually wondering whether that is a worry. Because there are places where people live and there are places where people work. And the places where people live tend to be less productive than the places where people work. That's fine, as long as the places where people live are well connected to the places where people work. And that's why the sort of connections idea is so important. I think really understanding what the purpose of a place is in a wider local economy, understanding what the productive potential of a place in a wider economy becomes really important for some of these place-based strategies. I'm going to end the presentation there. More than happy to share the slides, but be really looking forward to getting into the debate and discussion with you. Thank you very much.
That's fantastic, Mike. Thank you so much. That was a brilliant introduction to your work. And I think it demonstrates really well the range of policy levers and practical opportunities for local authorities and cities and places to consider. And your presentation touched on so many areas that align with the IGP's work. I'd just like to, before we open the floor, and I can see there's lots of questions coming in, I just wanted to pick up on what I think is a really important point that you made at the very beginning of your presentation, and then touched on a couple of times throughout, which is around language, and the language that is used in this space, and debates around inclusion and industrial strategy, and how expanding the language can open up new spaces for action, and how this connects to the importance of having political will to change. And I just wondered if you could say a little more on that process of kind of building support, shifting the parameters for the concepts that we use, and working with city and regional policymakers to think about opening up that space.
Yeah, sure. And actually, this is something that we've spent a lot of time thinking about at JRF over the last few years. But how do you build both political will and public will to solve poverty? And I think that you can apply those lessons and those learnings to this space as well, to the inclusive economy, inclusive growth space. And I think the first point is that you've got to understand where people are and where people are at. And I think the point that I was trying to make earlier about the reason why we landed on inclusive growth as a useful term is because the people who are trying to influence were using growth language and trying to start from where they were and move them forwards was sort of was the approach we're taking. And that is very much incremental change. It's about shifting the language and shifting the dial, and you might then want to keep going on that with that incremental change and keep trying to push the boundaries and expand the language. But that is a slow process, and it's different from the big bang radical ideas that we may want to adopt. But I think it's trying to understand where decision makers are now and how we can help them on a journey to become to create these more inclusive economies and try and deliver the outcomes that we really want to see.
That's fantastic, thank you. And I'd like to ask more on that, but I won't take all the time. So I'm just going to open the floor to some questions that we have coming in. I'm just going to read out a couple of these and then I will hand over to some of my colleagues who are live. So a question from Alex Brown. I believe the productivity statistic is brought down a lot by the high proportion of part-time and limited hours contract workers in the UK. Is there a better metric of economic productivity in your view? And or a better measure of how many people have good jobs in practice?
So I think the productivity stats are complicated and complex, and I think there is definitely evidence around part-time work and limited hours contracts playing into it. But I think even when you measure productivity based on hours worked rather than just FTE part-time jobs, then the UK's productivity rate is still much lower. I think trying to understand why that is the crucial point, rather than necessarily worrying too much about the measure, because I think even across all measures looking at our productivity performance is really bad. We sort of looked at it a little bit, and one of the things that really stands out is about management performance across sectors. And that's something that's applicable to lower paid sectors as well as higher paid sectors. And actually, just the quality of management in the UK is really poor. If you compare us to somewhere like the US, where actually there is pride in having achieved management training, that's not the same as the UK, and we think that's an area or one of the areas in which you could start to improve and help to really boost productivity.
Thank you. So our next question is from Hannah Collins. He says, thank you for a great talk. Do you have an opinion on the government's new skills in the UK white paper? And Hannah's point is about being unsure about how much they focus on basic skills, but also I think it connects to your previous point about management skills too.
Yeah, definitely. So I think our sort of general sense is that the white paper is probably moving in the right direction on that higher technical skills, and a lot of things that a lot of the ambitions of government in terms of expanding lifelong learning, bringing employers into it, and really making sure that skills and employment opportunities are matched up well, are all good ambitions to have. I think our concern would be about whether that's the deliverability of that, and whether the institutions and the sort of collective efforts that are required to achieve those aims are actually possible using the institutions that we currently have in place. I think that the point about basic skills is definitely missing, and a critique that we've made is that the skills white paper doesn't touch on basic skills. It doesn't touch on level 2 skills either, really. And I think one of our main concerns is that they are almost funded in a different pot in the UK through the adult education budget, and there's a danger that you end up with a slight twin track approach where there's a lot of investment going into the higher technical skills and higher technical education, which is great and really important and vital, but then the sort of basic skills, level 2 skills, particularly for adult learners over the age of 25, sort of get left behind. And we know that given the likely changes to the economy, given many of the big structural reforms that are coming down the line, such as automation and various other things that are going to be affecting the labour market, that adults are going to need to retrain and learn and relearn and reskill and enter into alternative jobs. At the moment, there isn't really a plan for that.
That's great, thank you. And just picking up on that response, I wonder if you could say a little more about the right kind of institutions that you think are needed to be able to deliver this strategy. Again, this is something that the IGP is very interested in, thinking about what kinds of institutions and new partnerships and collaborations are required.
Yeah, so I think it's always interesting operating in the UK context with this, given how centralised we are, and sometimes the instinct is to say, well, we just need some real devolution to the existing institutions that there are. And I think if you look at the course of the last, even the last 20 years or so, and the different sort of sub-regional institutions that have been tried and tested, some with more success than others, I think broadly where we stand at JF is that you probably need to have some sort of institution at a sort of labour market level. So I think the level of mayoral combined authorities feels about right in most places, particularly city regions, and that they need to be the coordinating bodies for pulling lots of these things together. But that does require, at the moment, really good coordination with local government, with national government, with employers, with skills providers. And actually what it comes down to often is the relationships between people. And I think there's something interesting in the UK at the moment where you can make the current system work well if you have good people making good relationships with each other. You can also make it work well if you have the right sort of institution, the right sort of institutional structure, whether that be a meeting or board where you pull the right people together, but as long as it's formalised. And I think the challenge at the moment is that none of that is consistent, and it is different, and it's often reliant upon individuals making the right connections rather than being guided to say, well, this is how we think it needs to be approached. And a really good example is that in the skills white paper, I think DWP is mentioned once in it, using a case study. And I think that lack of join up between our employment support services and our skills services is a big potential issue, particularly for the next sort of 18 months or so.
That's fantastic, thank you. I'd just like to invite my colleague Matthew Davis to come in now. Matt's going to ask a question live because he's with us on the panel.
Thanks, Saffron, and thanks, Mike, for a really great presentation. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I had a question, maybe it's slightly out of left field, but we know that national economies are embedded in global economies these days, and to some extent, it's really important to focus on the UK context. But I was just interested in whether you're dealing with and how you might deal with that interconnectivity and the fact that potentially inclusive growth in the UK could be based on unequal growth elsewhere in the world through supply chains, etc. And I was just wondering if you had some comments on that.
Yeah, definitely, and I completely agree with that. I think so. Because we are a UK focused organisation, we're very much focused on poverty in the UK. But actually, if you really do want to create more inclusive economies, then getting the supply chains right and making sure that as you say, it's not built off the back of exploitation or inequality elsewhere in the world is going to be crucial. I think one thing that I sometimes reflected on and spoken to about with local leaders is actually understanding our history of this as well, because the UK doesn't have a great track record on that side of things. And if you go and speak to some of the sort of former industrial heartlands in the northwest or in Yorkshire, people often hark back to, well, we were this big industrialized nation who were really high performing, and the places where we were used to be very productive and have high quality jobs. But there's probably less of an understanding if, for example, to take some of the cotton mills in Lancashire, that was built upon slavery and exploitation in another country. I mean, obviously there are definitely actions at the time in Lancashire and in Manchester to try and highlight that from working people, but at the same time, the economy is constructed that way, and I think there is a danger that an entirely just UK focus could lead down to some form of exploitation elsewhere in the world as well. I think we do need to grow our consciousness about that and really think deeply about those interconnected issues.
That's great, thank you. And that issue of interconnection leads us onto our next question from Chris Harker, who says, you mentioned degrowth critiques. Has Joseph Rowntree Foundation done any work in this area, perhaps to better understand how poverty is related to both climate emergency and mitigation?
Yeah, so we did some work earlier this decade. So it's a few years ago now that we're really doing a lot of work in this area. But I think the main thing that we really talked about was that actually people in poverty were often most at risk from climate emergency and from the negative impacts of global warming, and therefore there was an urgency from the perspective of people in poverty to really take action on that. I think there is the other side to it as well, though, is that recognising that we do need that just transition movement and moment, and ensure that people in poverty aren't pushed deeper into poverty because of some of the decisions that we need to make as a society to transition into a more sustainable future. And I think that's the bit where we're really interested in. So if you think about the sort of push for a Green New Deal and the support behind that, we're completely behind it. But I think the thing that we would want to do some work on and really think carefully about is how you ensure that people in poverty or people at risk of poverty can access opportunities and jobs that might be created as a result of those interventions. There's some really interesting stuff that happened in Hull when the wind farms, for example, and those factories were introduced, and who actually benefited from the jobs that were created. There were many people that were actually essentially imported into the local economy because of their skills, because of their expertise to do that work. But there was also a sort of on the side, there was also like a skills and employment program, which we were trying to upskill and help people in the local area who often had fewer skills or had been out the labour market for a while to access new opportunities. I think that's the sort of discussion that we would like to really get into and think carefully about what that means for people, what the skills and opportunities that we need to create.
That's great, thank you. And I just want to, there's a question coming in about the role of entrepreneurship in inclusive growth, which I think is a good follow-on from the point that you were just making. So the question from Paul Stevens is, have you considered the role of entrepreneurship in inclusive growth and whether policies and programs that encourage business startups have a role to play? Yeah,
I fully agree with that. I think there's something about how you ensure that entrepreneurs and people who are starting businesses actually are conscious of the type of employment, the type of jobs that they're creating, or the types of things they're trying to achieve through it. And there are definitely places locally, but also programs nationally that are really trying to develop more responsible entrepreneurs, more responsible business leaders. And I think as well as sort of programs that are trying to get into startups and people who are very entrepreneurial, the other angle is almost actually thinking about business management courses and MBAs and those sorts of institutions. Actually, what do those sort of more higher level business courses look like for people, and how can you ensure that good jobs and delivery of more inclusion is part of that?
Fantastic, thank you. So I'm just going to go to my colleague Jackie McGlade, who has a question on whether you could say something about the differences between rural and urban issues.
Yeah, so I think this is partly what I was trying to touch on a little bit at the end of my presentation, understanding the purpose of a place, and there are very different challenges in terms of rural and urban areas. I think a lot of the work that we've done in recent years, and particularly a lot of the work that underlies this presentation, is built around cities and city regions and more urban areas. But I think really trying to understand the problems and understand why rural areas are different is crucial, and part of that is around isolation. It's about job opportunities. It's about the kind of economy and the kind of jobs that rural areas are creating, and sort of some of that distance and connectivity that is a real problem. So like it's quite easy to design. It should be fairly easy to design reliable, affordable bus routes in an urban setting. It's much harder to do that in a rural area, and so the sorts of interventions that you might need to provide there might look slightly different. So, for example, there are schemes that have focused on access to personal motor vehicles, whether they be scooters or cars in rural areas, as a way of addressing that. There's obviously the digital connectivity issues, which are major. But I think that one of the big challenges is the skills aspect, because the availability and access to skills and learning is, again, easier in urban areas in a concentrated space. And I think that challenge of how you provide high quality and good skills that are connected to job opportunities in the local area can be quite hard for rural areas in particular.
And that raises an interesting point about the infrastructure in places, which I was really glad to see at the end of your presentation. So your references to the importance of decent and genuinely affordable housing, thinking about childcare, thinking about transport connectivity, and those public services and kind of infrastructures that go around work and employment and make it possible for people to make a living. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about thinking about the kind of local and regional understanding of those specific infrastructures and what could be put in place.
Yeah, definitely. So I think so one of the things that we've often talked about with local leaders is making sure that the decision making around those different things are fully joined up. So too often what we end up seeing is you have big, bold economic strategies, big, bold local industrial strategies, and then on one side you have a transport strategy, and then on a very other side you have a housing or planning strategy, and those three things are never fully joined up and spoken about. And what I've always been slightly surprised by working in local areas is how regularly and how often a transport plan is developed, but a land plan isn't developed at the same time, or even a land plan being very separate to a transport plan. So there might be a sort of 5-year, 10-year vision for strategic planning in a place, which includes which bits of land will be made available for housing development, which bits of land will be made available for employment development. But then there isn't the transport connectivity point made within that, and I think that's one of the challenges. And I think I'll go back to sort of the institutional point and the importance of having the right institutions at the right spatial scale, but also making sure that those connections and those relationships are well built and well resourced, so that those things can all happen in line with each other rather than being developed separately.
I think so, and that point connects very well to the work that the IGP has been doing, thinking about universal basic services around digital inclusion, around transport. But I think the point that you were making about skills training, it would be very interesting to think about that as part of a local infrastructure of basic services too. We've got a live question from my colleague Hannah Sender. Over to you, Hannah.
Sorry. Mike, that was really interesting. I've got 3 questions, but I'm only going to ask one. I don't know very much about inclusive growth or growth, actually, but as far as I understood it, growth was meant to improve people's lives across generations. And I guess job creation is a really important part of that. But I'm also wondering whether the Joseph Rowntree Foundation is thinking about other aspects of livelihoods and the kind of impossibility, I guess, of accessing some of those services or goods which will enable the next few generations to benefit from growth. So I'm thinking particularly of things like housing costs. So no matter how much I earn, I will never be able to afford the home that my parents have been able to afford. And I mean, obviously housing is very important, but there are many other things like education is now more expensive and so on. So I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about those ridiculously high ceilings that have been created and whether there's any thinking around inclusive growth that tackles more than jobs.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a really good question, and I think so. It's not an area that we've done lots of work on ourselves, but I know there has been bits of work in this space, and I think you know, again, one of the critiques of inclusive growth and its arguments ends up factoring on sort of wealth and wealth creation, actually who owns wealth and where that sits, and whether actually, although we're very focused on incomes and how you ensure that people are able to increase theirs, actually should we be focusing on increasing wealth as well and ownership of assets, whether it be collective or individual privately owned. And I think that's a really interesting area of debate. I think the intergenerational point is fascinating, and it's something that I think flows through many of those sort of big questions about services of the future. Because I think if you're designing, one of the questions that we've sometimes come back to is if you start to think about the future of, say, adult social care and start to rely upon you know, an older generation's wealth that they have through property ownership or other, and build the funding of that service through that model, an expectation of where it comes from. What happens in future generations where that same level of wealth and ownership might not exist? And I think ensuring that public services are funded sustainably and well is going to be at the heart of this. And I think one of the things that we've often talked about is local capacity, local institutions, the ability to access those local services, as Saffron says, is crucial and sort of an almost underpinning element of this. And in some ways, the presentation I've given is things that we think that local areas can do now, but underpinning that is probably understanding the expectation that we would want them to be better resourced and better funded in order to deliver some of those services that we all rely on.
That's fantastic, thank you. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, even though we haven't managed to get through all of our questions. But I just wanted to say thank you and invite our panel, who can actually give you some applause, to thank you live.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you. And thank you very much for joining us again.
Pleasure. It was really great. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Goodbye.
Bye.